Born into a curse she never understood, she has spent her life battling unexplained pain, fevers, suffocating breaths, and dreams of a man she has never met. Miles away, in a kingdom ruled by fear, a ruthless alpha king suffers the same fate. Cold, merciless, untouchable, or so the world believes. But behind the throne lies a secret that could shatter his reign. His life is bound to a fragile human he has never seen, and without her, he will die. When his condition spirals out of control, nearly costing the life of his beta son, the truth can no longer be buried. The girl is found, brought to the palace. And from the moment they meet, everything changes. The pain eases. The bond tightens. And the alpha realizes something far more dangerous than the curse itself. He needs her, but she is nothing like he expected. She doesn't fear him, doesn't bow, doesn't break. Instead, she challenges him, provokes him, and slowly becomes the only thing that can calm the storm inside him. What begins as survival turns into something deeper, darker, an obsession neither of them can escape. Because in a world where power is everything, the ruthless Alpha King's greatest weakness is the one thing he cannot control. Her.
It felt like a fist of molten iron closing around my heart. There was no warning. There never was. One moment, I was listening to a droning report on grain tariffs from a terrified advisor. The next, the air left the room, sucked into a vacuum that existed only inside my own chest. It begins. My wolf didn't just howl. It screamed, a primal, tortured sound that tore through my mental defenses. It scrabbled against the inside of my ribcage, desperate to escape a body that had suddenly become a torture chamber. The beast wanted to fight, to rip out the throat of whatever was strangling us. But there was nothing to kill. Just the curse, the ancient rotting legacy of my grandfather's sins, boiling in my blood. I didn't realize I'd stood up until the heavy council table shattered under my hands. The sound was a thunderclap in the cavernous throne room. Splinters the size of daggers flew outward, embedding themselves in the tapestries. The advisor scrambled backward on his hands and knees, whimpering. "Get out," I snarled. The voice wasn't mine. It was deep, guttural, vibrating with the tremors wrecking my body. They didn't need to be told twice. Guards, advisors, servants, they fled like rats before a fire. They knew this mood. They knew the rumors of the Mad King, the ruthless alpha whose temper was a sudden, violent storm. They didn't know it wasn't anger. It was agony so profound it eclipsed rational thought. I slumped forward, bracing my hands on the wreckage of the table, gasping for air that refused to fill my lungs. My vision blurred at the edges, swimming in red. Every beat of my heart was a fresh hammer blow. Sweat, cold and slick, broke across my forehead. "Make it stop. Goddess, make it stop." "Atlas!" The voice cut through the red haze. Greg, my beta. The only man alive who knew the pathetic truth behind the monster on the throne. I couldn't answer. A fresh wave of cramping pain buckled my knees. I hit the stone floor hard, one hand clawing at the granite, slipping on my own sweat. My canines ripped through my lower lip, the copper taste of blood flooding my mouth. "Atlas, breathe. Focus on me." Greg was closer now. Too close. My wolf perceived movement as a threat. In this state, blind with pain, there were no allies. There were only things that were not me. A younger scent mixed with Greg's. Pine and nervous sweat. His son, Kalin. A newly shiftable pup, barely 18, serving his first month in the Royal Guard. "Father, don't," the boy started, his voice trembling. The sound was a trigger. I didn't decide to move. The beast took over. seeking an outlet for the burning pressure in my veins. I was a blur of lethal instinct, launching myself across the stone floor. I slammed into the younger wolf before he could even raise his spear. The boy hit the nearest pillar with a sickening crunch. He slumped to the floor, dazed, blood trickling from his hairline. It wasn't enough. The pressure was still there. I loomed over him, my hand closing around his throat, my claws extending, ready to puncture the major artery. The beast demanded blood for the pain. "Atlas, no!" Greg threw his entire weight against me, shoving me back just an inch. It was enough to break the beast's focus. I blinked, the red receding just enough to see what I was holding. Kalin's eyes were wide, terrified, rolling back in his head. My own Beta's son. A boy I had watched grow up. I released him as if his skin were burned. I stumbled back, crashing against the dais of the throne, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The physical pain was still there, blinding and absolute, but a cold shaft of horror pierced through it. I had almost killed a pack member. Not an enemy, not a traitor, a boy. "Get him out of here," I choked out, turning my back on them, leaning my forehead against the cold stone of the throne. Shame burned hotter than the curse. This was what I was reduced to. A rabid dog biting its own master. I heard Greg shuffling, helping his groaning son to his feet. The heavy doors boomed shut as Kalin was helped away. But Greg remained. I felt his presence behind me, steady and furious. "This ends today, Atlas," Greg said. His voice held a tone I had never heard him use with his king. Command. I spun around, ready to snap at his insubordination, but another spasm of pain nearly doubled me over. I held on to the throne, my knuckles white. "You think I want this?" I spat, blood dripping from my chin onto the velvet tunic. "Want it or not, you are losing control. You nearly murdered my son because your grandfather slaughtered a coven 100 years ago." Greg stepped closer, his jaw set hard. "I will not watch you destroy yourself, and I will not watch you destroy this kingdom because you are too proud to accept the cure." "There is no cure," I snarled, the suffocation making my head swim. "Only the tether." "Then take the damn tether." He threw something onto the floor between us. A dossier, mugshots, shaky surveillance photos of a small, pale woman coming out of a mundane human coffee shop. I stared at the photos, repulsion warring with the agony in my chest. A human, a fragile breakage thing. This was what fate had decided my life was worth. The curse was designed to humiliate me, to bind the strongest alpha in generations to the weakest possible vessel. "What have you done, Greg?" My voice was dangerously quiet. "What you wouldn't," he replied, not backing down. "I found her. I tried to tell you weeks ago, but you refused to listen. After today, after Kalin, I made the call." The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You went behind my back. I saved your life. You committed treason. Execute me later," Greg snapped. "Right now, you need to breathe." He gestured to the heavy double doors at the far end of the hall. "She's here, Atlas. She's just outside those doors." I froze. The pain was eating me alive, my heart stuttering in its cage. I hated her instantly. I hated her for existing. I hated that my mighty bloodline, my immense power, was currently being brought to its knees by the absence of a creature who probably couldn't even lift a sword. I was the ruthless king. I needed nothing. I feared nothing. And yet, as I stood there, suffocating in my own throne room, I knew the terrifying truth. I was going to die if those doors didn't open. "Bring her in," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Before I kill you for bringing her at all."
I'd been awake since 3 in the morning, though awake was a generous term for the state of delirious, feverish restlessness I lived in. The blankets were kicked into a tangled mess at the foot of my bed, too hot 1 second, freezing the next. The phantom pain had settled in my chest again, a dull, crushing weight right behind my sternum. It wasn't a heart attack. I'd had every test known to modern medicine, and my heart was perfectly, frustratingly healthy. It was just there, like an invisible hand squeezing the life out of me day in and day out. It was always worse at night. That's when the dreams came. The man. I never saw his face, only a towering, broad-shouldered silhouette against a stark, cold landscape. He was always angry, always in pain, and I could feel it, a mirror image of my own suffering, but magnified 1,000 times. I would wake up gasping, my lungs burning, as if I'd been running for my life from something I couldn't see. Tonight was different. The pain was sharper, more insistent. It wasn't just a dull ache, it was a frantic pulling, a desperate tug behind my navel that urged me to go, somewhere, anywhere but here. I threw the covers off completely and stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face. The reflection that stared back was pale and gaunt, dark circles smudged under my eyes. Fragile, my mother always called me. Delicate. I hated those words. They made me sound breakable, like fine china that had to be kept on a high shelf, untouched. But I wasn't breakable. I was enduring. Every day was a battle against an invisible enemy, and I was still standing. The knocking on my front door at this hour should have terrified me. I lived alone in a quiet suburban neighborhood, but the strange, pulling sensation in my gut intensified with each rap of knuckles against wood. It wasn't fear I felt. It was anticipation. I pulled on a robe and crept to the door, peering through the peephole. A man stood on my porch. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, but he didn't look like a businessman. He looked like a soldier out of uniform. He was tall, broad, with a jawline that could cut glass, and eyes that held a predatory sharpness, even in the dim porch light. "Who is it?" I called through the door, trying to keep my voice steady. "My name is Greg," the man said. His voice was deep, smooth, and carried an authority that made my skin prickle. "I'm here about your condition, Stella." I froze. No one knew about my condition except my doctors and my parents. "What condition?" I asked, my hand reaching for the deadbolt, ready to lock it tighter. "The fevers, the chest pains, the breathlessness that comes without warning." He paused, and I could almost feel him looking through the wood. "The dreams of a man you've never met." My breath hitched. How could he possibly know that? I unlocked the door slowly, opening it just a crack. Greg didn't push his way in. He just stood there, watching me with an unsettling intensity. "I can make it stop," he said simply. The words hung in the air between us. It was the promise I had been waiting my entire life to hear. "How?" I whispered, my skepticism battling with a desperate hope. "It's complicated, and it comes with a price." His gaze was unblinking. "But if you come with me tonight, the pain will end. The fevers will break. You will finally be able to breathe." "What's the price?" I asked, my voice stronger now. I wasn't a fool. Nothing in life was free, especially not a miracle cure from a stranger in the middle of the night. Greg held my gaze. "Your freedom?" I stared at him. "You're kidnapping me?" "No, I'm offering you a choice." He stepped a little closer, his voice dropping lower. "You are tied to someone, Stella. Someone very powerful and very difficult. His life is bound to yours, and yours to his. He is dying because you are not with him." "That sounds insane," I said, my mind reeling. "Tied? Like magic?" "Like a curse," he corrected, his expression grim. "One that is killing you both slowly. You feel his pain, and he feels yours. The dreams are your connection trying to manifest, and the only way to break the cycle of suffering is for the two of you to be in close proximity." My chest constricted, a fresh wave of the familiar agony washing over me. I clutched the doorframe, my knuckles white. "Who is he?" "His name is Atlas," Greg said, the name heavy on his tongue. He is a king. I nearly laughed. A king? This man was clearly delusional. I think you should leave. You're hurting right now, aren't you? Greg pressed, his eyes narrowing. It feels like a vice around your ribs, like you're drowning in dry air. I couldn't deny it. The pain was blinding. If you come with me, he said softly, extending a hand, it stops. Now. I looked at his outstretched hand. It was a lifeline, a terrifying, unknown lifeline. But then I thought of the endless nights of fever, the breathlessness, the constant feeling of being trapped in my own failing body. I thought of the man in my dreams, the one whose pain felt so real. I was already a prisoner of this curse, whatever it was. Greg was just offering me a different cell, one where perhaps I wouldn't be in constant pain. I didn't trust him. I didn't believe in curses or kings, but I did believe in the agony that was currently crippling me. I took a shuddering breath, making the decision not out of trust, but out of a desperate need for control. If this was the only way to stop the suffering, I would take it. Okay, I whispered, placing my hand in his. Take me to him. Silence. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the vacuum left after a catastrophic explosion. The agony that had been my constant companion for 26 years, the crushing weight on my chest, the shallow, burning intake of breath, had simply evaporated. 1 second it was there, buckling my knees, and the next, as my eyes locked with the burning amber gaze of the man on the throne, it was gone. I stood in the centre of the cavernous hall, my lungs filling with air so deeply it felt alien, almost intoxicating. I wasn't wheezing, my heart wasn't stuttering, I was just breathing. But the relief was immediately eclipsed by terror. The man on the throne, Atlas, the Alpha King, didn't look relieved. He looked murderous. He was terrifyingly large, filling the massive stone throne with a predatory stillness that was far worse than the chaotic violence Greg had described. His chest, broad and encased in a black tunic embroidered with silver thread, was heaving. His hands griped the stone armrest so tightly I heard solid rock groan under the pressure. He was staring at me not like a savior, but like a disease he had just contracted. The sheer hatred radiating from him was a physical force, heavy and suffocating in a completely new way. "Get her out of my sight," he snarled. His voice was low, a rumble of thunder trapped underground, but it carried to every corner of the silent room. Greg, the beta who had ripped me from my life only hours ago, stepped forward nervously. "Sire, the proximity is required for the stabilization to hold." "I said," Atlas roared, leaping to his feet, "get her out." The movement was so sudden, so inhumanly fast, that I flinched backward. He was a mountain of raw, lethal power. My instincts, long dormant because I'd never had the energy to be afraid, screamed at me to run. But I couldn't look away from him. It felt like an invisible wire had been hooked into my navel, pulling me toward him even as my mind screamed to flee. Greg grabbed my arm, his grip tight and anxious. "Come with me, quickly!" He practically dragged me out of the throne room. The massive oak doors boomed shut behind us, severing the visual connection to the king. Instantly, a dull throb returned to my temples. It wasn't the crippling pain from before, but a faint echo, a warning. "What just happened?" I gasped, trying to keep up with Greg's hurried pace through the labyrinthine stone corridors of the palace. "The pain, it just stopped." "That is the nature of the bond," Greg said tightly, not looking at me. He seemed shaken, pale beneath his tan. And that was the Alpha King restraining himself from tearing this entire castle down because he hates that you exist. I swallowed hard. He looked like he wanted to kill me. Greg finally glanced at me, his expression grim. "He does want to kill you, Stella, more than anything in the world. The only thing stopping him is that if you die, he dies too. Welcome to my new life." They didn't take me to a dungeon. They took me to a wing of the palace that smelled of beeswax and lavender, far removed from the main halls. Greg ushered me into a set of double doors, and then immediately backed out. "Stay here. Don't attempt to leave. Guards will be posted outside. Food will be brought to you." "Wait, Greg, what am I supposed to do?" I asked, panic finally starting to override the shock. "Exist," he said grimly. Just stay alive. That is your only job now." The doors clicked shut, and I heard the distinct, heavy slide of a deadbolt engaging from the outside. I turned to survey my prison. It was exquisite. The room was very large, furnished with heavy carved wood furniture and rich velvet tapestries in deep blues and golds. A massive four-poster bed dominated one wall, sheer netting draped around it like a cloud. I walked to the towering windows. They looked out onto a sheer cliff drop, a dark, churning ocean crashing against rocks hundreds of feet below, and set into the stone frame of the window were thick, decorative iron bars. A gilded cage. I sank onto the edge of the massive bed. For the first time in my memory, I wasn't in pain. I took a deep breath, then another, testing the capacity of my own lungs. It was miraculous. It was addictive. But beneath the physical relief, something else was taking root. A pervasive, insidious tugging sensation deep in my core. It felt like gravity had shifted, pulling not down, but outward, toward the heart of the palace. Towards him. Hours passed. Night fell, turning the ocean outside my window into an inky void. Servants brought a tray of elaborate food, roasted fowl, exotic fruits, rich wine, and set it down without making eye contact, fleeing the room as quickly as they had entered. I picked at the food, taste-testing freedom, but anxiety churned in my stomach. I couldn't sleep. The silence of the palace was heavy, oppressive. I felt like a trespasser in a dragon's lair, waiting for the inevitable burst of fire. The tugging sensation grew stronger with every hour the moon rose higher. It was past midnight when the lock on my door clicked open. It wasn't the hesitant click of a servant. It was forceful, angry. The doors slammed open, hitting the stone walls with a deafening crash. Atlas stood framed in the doorway. The hallway lights illuminated him from behind, casting his face in shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me, glowing embers in the dark. He had shed the formal tunic and was wearing only a loose black shirt that did nothing to hide the terrifying expanse of his shoulders and chest. He didn't speak. He stepped inside and kicked the door shut behind him. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from sickness, but from pure, unadulterated fear. I scrambled backward on the bed until my back hit the headboard, pulling my knees to my chest. He began to walk toward me. He moved like a predator stalking wounded prey, slow, deliberate, silent. The air in the room grew thick, charged with static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. The sheer size of him was overwhelming. He seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the massive room. He reached the side of the bed. He towered over me, a monolith of muscle and suppressed rage. I could hear his breath, ragged, harsh, like he was fighting a physical battle just to stand there. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice shaking so badly it was barely audible. He didn't answer. He just stared down at me, his fists clenched at his sides. The tension emanating from him was so intense I thought his skin might split. He leaned down slowly. I pressed myself harder against the headboard, squeezing my eyes shut, waiting for the blow, waiting for his hands to wrap around my throat. I felt his breath, hot and smelling faintly of brandy against my cheek. He was inches from my face. I opened my eyes. His were wide, amber swirls of fury and something else, something tortured. His entire body was vibrating, shaking with the effort of restraint. His hand hovered just above my knee, fingers curled like claws, twitching. He wanted to hurt me. Every instinct in his alpha body was screaming at him to destroy the weak thing that had enslaved him. But he couldn't touch me. The curse wouldn't let him. He let out a sound that was half growl, half groan, and jerked his hand back as if I were made of fire. He spun on his heel and paced away from the bed, raking his hands through his dark hair, radiating a frustration so violent it felt like it could shatter the windows. I watched him, trembling in my gilded cage, realizing with terrifying clarity the dynamic of my new life. I was trapped in a room with a monster who desperately wanted to devour me, but who would starve if he did. A week passed in a strange, suffocating luxury. My life, previously defined by the sharp boundaries of pain and exhaustion, now had new borders, thick stone walls draped in priceless tapestries, windows barred with gilded iron, and the terrifying, imposing presence of Atlas. Or rather, his absence. After that first night, when he had loomed over my bed like a storm cloud unable to break, he hadn't returned to my room. Instead, he existed on the periphery of my senses. The bond, that psychic tug Greg had called a curse, was a constant low-level hum under my skin. I knew when Atlas was in the palace. I knew when he was agitated, which was often, feeling it as a prickling heat at the back of my neck. I knew when he left the grounds, the hum fading to a dull emptiness that was somehow worse than the tension. He communicated only through decrees delivered by terrified servants who refused to make eye contact with me. Rule 1, do not leave the East Wing under any circumstances. Rule 2, do not speak to the guards. Rule 3, do not draw attention to yourself. I was a ghost in a golden machine. I was fed exotic meals I couldn't finish, bathed in scented oils, and dressed in silks that felt too heavy against my skin. But the most jarring change was the silence in my own body. For 26 years, every breath had been a negotiation. Now, I woke up and inhaled deeply, my lungs expanding without the familiar catch of pain. I walked the length of my suite, a distance that would have winded me a week ago, and felt nothing but a strange, restless energy bubbling in my veins. It was maddening. I had been given the gift of health, only to be locked in a box where I couldn't use it. On the 8th day, Greg finally returned. He looked exhausted, shadows smudged beneath his eyes, carrying a stack of leather-bound books. "The king thought you might be bored," he said stiffly, setting them on a heavy table. "The king hasn't spoken a word to me in a week," I retorted, surprised by the sharpness in my own voice. The old Stella wouldn't have had the energy for sarcasm. The new Stella was vibrating with it. "I'm not bored, Greg. I'm a prisoner." Greg sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He didn't argue. He just walked over to the window, looking out at the churning grey ocean below. "It's for your own protection, Stella, and his." I walked over to stand near him. The proximity to the cliff edge made my stomach swoop, even through the glass. Why does he hate me so much? He doesn't even know me. Greg turned slowly. His expression was a complicated mix of pity and hard pragmatism. "You know it's not personal." It feels pretty personal when he looks at me like he wants to rip my throat out. "He looks at you and sees a mistake made 100 years ago," Greg said, his voice dropping. He gestured vaguely around the opulent room. "Do you know why this wing was built so far from the rest of the palace?" I shook my head. "It was built for the first cursed alpha. My great-grandfather served him." Greg leaned against the stone sill. Atlas's grandfather was a brutal man. He didn't just defeat his enemies, he obliterated them. There was a coven of witches near the southern border who refused to bend the knee. He slaughtered them all in a single night. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the ocean draft. The high priestess, as she lay dying in the mud, used her final breath and the blood of her coven to cast a tether. Greg continued grimly. She cursed his bloodline. She decreed that the firstborn alpha of every generation would be bound, body and soul, to the weakest human vessel the fates could find, a creature incapable of surviving on her own, a drain on his immense power. I stared at him, the horrific weight of it settling over me. Me, I'm the weak vessel. "You are the punishment," Greg corrected gently but firmly. "Atlas is the most powerful alpha this kingdom has seen in 3 generations. And he is tied to a human who, until a week ago, couldn't walk up a flight of stairs. If you get sick, he weakens. If you die, the shock to his system will kill him instantly." He looked me dead in the eye. "He hates you because you are the living, breathing cage that holds his life hostage. You are the embodiment of his grandfather's sins, forced upon him every second of every day." Greg left shortly after, leaving me alone with the suffocating truth. I wasn't just a captive. I was a walking curse. No wonder he couldn't stand to be in the same room with me. No wonder the urge to kill me warred with the necessity to keep me alive. I paced the room for hours. The restless energy in my newly healthy body turned jagged. I felt the hum of the bond, the connection to the man who despised me. Do not leave the East Wing. The words echoed in my head, a command from a king to his unwanted possession. I stopped pacing. I looked at the grand double doors that led out of my suite and into the main corridor of the wing. Beyond those doors lay a hallway, and at the end of that hallway was an archway marked with the royal crest, the boundary line. 2 stone-faced guards always stood there. For my whole life, pain had dictated my boundaries. I stopped walking when my chest hurt. I stopped talking when I ran out of air. Pain had been my master. Now, pain was gone, replaced by Atlas. A hot flush of rebellion burned through me, sharper and more intoxicating than the fever ever was. I was healthy, I could breathe, and I was done letting invisible forces tell me where I could and could not go. If I was going to be a prisoner, I was going to be a difficult one. I walked to the doors and threw them open. The 2 guards posted immediately outside straightened, their hands dropping to the hilts of the swords at their waists. "My lady," one of them said, his voice flat. "Please return inside." I ignored him. I began to walk down the long, tapestried corridor toward the archway at the end. "My lady!" The guards scrambled to follow me, their heavy boots thudding on the stone runner. "You are forbidden to pass the archway." I could feel Atlas now. The hum in my blood intensified into a vibrating buzz. He was somewhere in the palace, and his attention had just snapped toward me. He felt my intent. Very good. I reached the archway, the boundary. The 2 stationary guards crossed their halberds in front of the opening, blocking my path. They were massive, immovable objects of leather and steel. "Step back," the guard on the left commanded. He wasn't polite this time. I stopped inches from the crossed blades. My heart was pounding, a hard, fast rhythm that felt powerful, not failing. "No," I said. And then, deliberately, I raised my foot and stepped over the invisible line on the floor, pressing my chest right against the cold steel of their halberds. The reaction was instantaneous. A siren began to wail, a horrific mechanical shriek that echoed off the stone walls. Red lights pulsed from sconces I hadn't noticed before. The guards shouted, grabbing my arms with bruising force to haul me back. But beneath the chaos, I felt something else. A roar in my own head that wasn't mine. A wave of pure molten fury sweeping through the bond, rolling toward me like a tsunami. Atlas was coming. The guards didn't just stop me, they seized me. Armored hands clamped down on my shoulders, digging into muscle with a force that would have dislocated them a week ago. Now it just hurt. A sharp, blinding sting of real physical consequence that I welcomed because it was my choice that caused it. "Release her!" The voice didn't come from the corridor. It seemed to erupt from the very stones of the palace walls. It was a roar so primal, so saturated with raw power, that the guards dropped me instantly, scrambling backward as if I'd suddenly burst into flames. I stumbled, catching myself against the cold stone of the archway I had just violated. The siren cut out abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake that was somehow louder than the alarm. At the far end of the hall, Atlas appeared. He didn't walk, he stalked. Every step was a turbulent display of leashed violence. He was still wearing the loose black shirt from the other night, now straining across his shoulders as if his muscles were trying to tear free of his skin. His eyes were glowing, actually glowing, a fierce molten gold that burned through the shadows of the corridor. The guards didn't even wait for a dismissal. They flattened themselves against the wall, heads bowed in terrifying submission, before practically dissolving into the shadows to escape his path. It was just us. Again. He closed the distance in seconds, a dark tidal wave crashing down on me. He didn't stop until he had crowded me against the stone pillar of the archway, his forearms slamming against the wall on either side of my head, boxing me in. He smelled of ozone, hot metal, and a deeply masculine scent that was terrifyingly intoxicating. His chest heaved inches from mine, the heat radiating from his body searing my skin even without contact. "You think this is a game?" he snarled, his voice a low, vibrating frequency that rattled my teeth. "You think because I cannot kill you, I cannot break you?" My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I looked up, meeting his burning gaze head-on. I forced myself not to flinch, not to shrink away from the sheer, terrifying size of him. "Then do it," I whispered, the words scraping my throat. His eyes widened slightly, the gold swirling chaotically. He hadn't expected that. He expected tears. He expected begging. "Break me," I pushed, my voice gaining strength, fueled by a lifetime of frustration. "You hate me. You look at me like I'm the disease that's rotting you from the inside out. So why haven't you done it yet? Why did you stop the other night?" He froze. The breath hissed through his clenched teeth. His entire massive frame went rigid against the stone, his knuckles turning white where they gripped the wall above my shoulders. It was the question that hung between us, the unspoken paradox of our existence. He wanted to destroy me, yet his instinct, the curse, had stopped him inches from my skin. For a second I thought he might actually snap. The air crackled around us, thick with his internal war. I saw the struggle in his eyes, the beast fighting the man, both of them warring with the golden chain that bound him to me. Then, everything shifted. It wasn't a sound. It was a sensation that ripped through the psychic bond between us. A sharp, jarring intrusion that had nothing to do with me. It felt like a migraine snapping into place behind his eyes, a wave of cold, calculated irritation that doused his fiery rage in an instant. He flinched, his head snapping toward the main atrium of the palace, away from me. The golden glow in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a hard, icy clarity. Someone was here, someone important, someone he didn't want here. He looked back at me, and the murderous intent was gone, replaced by cold, ruthless evaluation. He looked at me not as a curse, but as a piece on a chessboard. He suddenly needed to move. Before I could react to the shift, his hand shot out and clamped around my wrist. It wasn't a gentle hold. His fingers were like steel bands, gripping tight enough to bruise bone. I gasped at the sudden pressure, but he ignored it. "You want out of this wing?" he growled, pulling me away from the wall with a jerk that nearly pulled my arm from its socket. "Fine. You wanted my attention, Stella. You have it." He turned and began to stride down the hallway toward the main palace, dragging me behind him like a doll. "Where are you taking me?" I gasped, stumbling to keep up with his long, punishing strides. He didn't look back. "To see exactly what kind of world you were so desperate to step into." He didn't let go. His grip on my wrist was a manacle of bone and sinew, tight enough to cut off circulation as he dragged me through corridors I'd never seen. The architecture shifted from the quiet, oppressive luxury of my wing into something grander, colder, and infinitely more intimidating. Enormous vaulted ceilings swallowed the sound of our footsteps. Tapestries depicting bloody battles replaced the soothing landscapes of my room. Guards in full ceremonial armor snapped to attention as Atlas passed, their faces masks of terrified reverence. They didn't even dare to look at the human woman stumbling in his wake. My heart was doing double time, the adrenaline sickeningly thick in my blood. I had wanted out of my cage. I had wanted to see the world that had created a monster like Atlas. "Be careful what you wish for." He stopped abruptly, outside a set of colossal mahogany doors, carved with roaring wolves. The sudden halt nearly sent me sprawling onto the polished stone floor. Before I could regain my balance, he released my wrist, my skin throbbing where his fingers had pressed, and grabbed my shoulder instead. His grip was impersonal, functional, like he was handling a piece of luggage he despised carrying. "In there," he said, his voice devoid of the fiery rage from the hallway. It was ice now, sub-zero and brittle. "You speak to no one. You look at no one. You exist, silent and invisible. Do you understand?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The sheer radiating power coming off him was making my newly healthy lungs feel shallow again. He pushed the doors open with a casual shove that would have required 2 normal men to achieve. The council chamber was enormous, dominated by a long table made of dark, ancient wood. The air inside was thick with tension, testosterone, and the scent of expensive leather and unfamiliar alphas. 3 men rose as Atlas entered. 2 were clearly subordinates, bulky and anxious. The third man, standing at the head of the table opposite where Atlas would sit, was different. He was leaner than Atlas, his hair a slicked back blonde, and his smile was all teeth and no warmth. "King Atlas," the blonde man said, his voice smooth like oil over gravel. "We weren't expecting the honor of your direct presence today. Greg led us to believe." "Greg is occupied," Atlas cut him off, striding toward the head of the table. He didn't introduce me. He didn't acknowledge my presence at all, other than the relentless grip on my shoulder steering me forward. He stopped at the head of the table. He didn't sit. He looked down at the spot on the floor directly beside his massive chair. "Sit," he commanded. I blinked, looking from the hard stone floor to his impassive face. "On the floor," he clarified, his tone brooking no argument. Humiliation burned hot behind my eyes. He wasn't just bringing me into his world. He was displaying my place in it. Lowest of the low, a human cur at the feet of the Alpha King. But the throbbing in my wrist reminded me that disobedience here wasn't like disobedience in my wing. Here, there were witnesses. Here, his reputation was on the line. I sank to the floor, folding my legs beneath me, the heavy silk of the dress puddling around me like a mockery of royalty. Atlas sat down. His large frame loomed over me, his thigh inches from my shoulder. The meeting began. I learned two things very quickly. First, the blonde man was Alpha Vane, a rival from a neighbouring territory regarding a trade dispute that was clearly a thin veil for a power grab. Second, I learned why Atlas was terrifying. In my wing, he was a storm of uncontrollable rage. Here, he was a glacier. He was ruthless, precise, and devastatingly intelligent. He didn't raise his voice once. He dissected Vane's arguments with surgical precision, turning the other Alpha's words into traps that snapped shut around him. And as I sat there, invisible at his feet, I realized something else. The bond, that psychic tether I hated, was quiet. Usually, being near him felt like standing next to a vibrating generator. But now, with his leg almost brushing my shoulder, he was eerily calm. The chaotic energy was gone, funneling into a laser focus on Vane. It hit me with the force of a physical blow. He was using me. He had dragged me here not just to humiliate me, but because my presence, the accursed anchor to his humanity, forced his wolf into submission. I was his leash. I was the tranquilizer that allowed him to be this cold, calculating king instead of the rage-filled monster I had seen in the hallway. I felt sick. I was a tool in his arsenal, nothing more. The tension in the room ratcheted up as Vane realized he was being cornered politely. He was sweating now, his oily smile straining at the edges. He needed a distraction. He needed a weakness. His eyes flicked down. To me. I froze. Vane's gaze crawled over me, assessing, dismissive, and then abruptly, lewd. A human woman, clearly not a servant, sitting in submission at Atlas's feet in a silk gown. It was an anomaly he couldn't ignore. Above me, Atlas went agonizingly still, the glacial calm fractured. "An interesting pet you keep, Atlas," Vane said, leaning back in his chair, a smirk touching his lips. The shift in tone was jarring. "I didn't take you for the type to keep human toys. A bit fragile for a king of your appetite, isn't she?" The air in the room vanished. The other two subordinates went pale, staring at the table. Atlas didn't speak. His hand, resting on the arm of his chair just above my head, tightened until the wood groaned audibly. Vane, mistaking the silence for tolerance, pushed his luck. His eyes raked over me again, lingering on the curve of my neck. "Tell you what," Vane said, his voice dropping to a sleazy purr. "Forget the northern timber tariffs. Give me the girl for a weekend. I've always wondered if humans break as easily as they—" He never finished the sentence. The sound that tore out of Atlas wasn't human. It wasn't the growl I'd heard before. It was a roar. A primal, deafening explosion of sound that shook the foundations of the room. It was pure, unadulterated possessiveness, a sonic wave of fury so intense it blew the heavy council doors open fiercely enough to crack the wood. Vane scrambled backward, his chair tipping over, crashing to the floor as he fell onto his backside, his face drained of blood. The guards outside rushed to the doorway, weapons drawn, only to freeze in abject terror at the sight of their king. Atlas was standing now. His chair was overturned behind him, his chest was heaving, and his eyes were molten gold fires, burning with a ferocity that wasn't calculated or political. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared up at him, trembling violently, my heart threatening to burst. Vane was terrified. The guards were terrified. But as the echoes of the roar faded, Atlas looked down at his own clenched fists, his expression fracturing into something that looked terrified too. He hadn't meant to do that. The monster had just slipped the leash. The silence on the walk back to the east wing was heavier than the oak doors Atlas had nearly shattered. He didn't drag me this time. He didn't need to. The sheer, vibrating aura of his fury was a physical wall that kept me pressed close to his side, walking in lockstep with his long, punishing strides. My wrist still throbbed where he had gripped it, a dull ache that was nothing compared to the pounding of my own heart. That roar. It was still ringing in my ears, a primal sound that had stripped the civility right out of the air. I had seen the terror on Vane's face, the way the guards had nearly dropped their weapons. But most terrifying of all was the look on Atlas's face in the second before he'd masked it, the sheer, horrifying realization of what he had done. He had lost control, over a human, over me. We burst through the double doors of my wing, the two guards posted outside, scrambling to get out of his way. He didn't stop at the entrance to my room. He kept walking, past my door, further down a corridor I hadn't explored. "Where are we going?" I ventured, my voice sounding thin and reedy. He stopped abruptly in front of a set of towering obsidian black doors. He didn't look at me. His jaw was working, the muscles tight beneath his skin. "Your new quarters," he grated out. I stared at the doors. What was wrong with the old ones? He finally turned to look at me. His golden eyes were churning, a chaotic mix of rage and something else I couldn't decipher. Something that looked dangerously like panic. "What's wrong?" he snarled, stepping closer until I had to crane my neck to look at him. "Is that I have a palace full of snakes who now know exactly where to strike to make me bleed." His words hung in the air, stark and terrifying. Vain, the lewd comments, the roar. It hadn't just been an insult, it had been a probe, a test of Atlas's weakness, and he had failed spectacularly. By defending me with such feral intensity, he had painted a target on my back larger than the kingdom itself. "You're moving me because of Vane," I whispered. "I am moving you because if you are out of my sight, you are a liability," he corrected, his voice icy. "And I am done with liabilities." He pushed the black doors open. The room beyond was enormous, easily 3 times the size of the room I'd been staying in. It was less a bedroom and more a royal apartment, decorated in deep blues, charcoal greys and silver. It was masculine, imposing and utterly cold. But the most arresting feature wasn't the massive 4-poster bed or the fireplace big enough to stand in. It was the single, heavy wooden door set into the far wall. Atlas followed my gaze. "My chambers," he said flatly. My stomach dropped. Adjoining rooms. "You're putting me right next to you," I said, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. "I am putting you where I can hear you breathe," he said, the threat implicit. "Where I know if you so much as twitch." He turned and walked toward the adjoining door. He paused with his hand on the iron handle, his back to me. "Do not make me regret this, Stella." Then he opened the door and disappeared through it, slamming it shut behind him with a finality that echoed through the cavernous room. There was no lock on my side. The rest of the day dissolved into a strange, high-stakes game of house. Servants I'd never seen before bustled in, moving my meagre belongings from the old room, the few dresses I'd been given, the books Greg had brought. They worked in terrified silence, eyes darting toward the adjoining door as if expecting a monster to burst through at any moment. I heard the whispers too, in the corridors, echoing just beyond the range of distinct words. Human pet. The king's weakness. Vane saw it. The labels felt like tar, sticky and suffocating. I wasn't just a prisoner anymore. I was a spectacle, a flaw in their perfect, powerful king. By nightfall, the servants were gone, leaving me alone in the echoing silence of the new room. It wasn't silent, though. Not really. Through the thick wood of the connecting door, I could hear him. The heavy thud of his boots as he paced, the scrape of a chair, the murmur of low voices as guards or advisors came and went, their tones hushed and reverent. I sat on the edge of the massive bed, my hands clasped tight in my lap. The bond hummed beneath my skin, a constant low-voltage current. It was stronger now, amplified by proximity. I could feel the waves of his agitation rolling off him like heat from a furnace. He was furious, at Vane, at himself, at the universe for tying him to a creature he despised. And he was right there, just a few inches of wood away. The air in the room felt thin, charged with the static of his presence. Every time his footsteps approached the door, my breath hitched. Every time they moved away, a complicated mix of relief and strange disappointment washed over me. It was agonizing. I was trapped in a golden cage with a predator pacing just outside the bars, and the lock on the door was on his side. Eventually, exhaustion won out over anxiety. I changed into the silk nightgown that had been laid out for me, a deep sapphire blue that felt too luxurious for a prisoner, and climbed into the enormous cold bed. I lay in the dark, staring at the canopy above, listening. The pacing had stopped. The voices were gone. Silence. But even in the silence, the bond pulsed. A steady, rhythmic thrum that matched the beat of my own heart. A constant reminder that I was not alone, that I would never be alone again. I closed my eyes, willing sleep to come, praying that for once the nightmares would stay away. The dream started the same way it always did. I was running through a dense, fog-choked forest. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and rot. My lungs burned, the old familiar pain clawing at my chest, making every breath a ragged gasp. Behind me, something was coming, something big, something hungry. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its eyes on me. Cold, predatory, and infinitely patient. It wasn't chasing me, it was herding me. The ground beneath my feet turned to mud, sucking at my ankles, slowing me down. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches like gnarled fingers reaching out to snag my clothes, my hair. I stumbled, falling to my hands and knees in the icy sludge. The breath was knocked out of me, a sharp, agonizing wheeze. I couldn't get up. The pain was too much. The weakness that had defined my life was back, a crushing weight holding me down. The presence behind me stopped. I could hear its breath now, a low, wet rasp that sent shivers down my spine. A shadow fell over me, blocking out the meagre light filtering through the canopy. I knew, with the terrifying certainty of a dream, that if I looked up, I would see the faceless man. The one who had haunted my sleep for as long as I could remember. "Get up," a voice whispered in my head. Not my voice. "Get up, little bird." I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable touch, the cold hand that always grabbed my shoulder right before I woke up screaming. But the touch didn't come. Instead, a strange warmth bloomed in the center of my chest, right where the pain was sharpest. It was a searing golden heat that burned away the cold, the fear, the weakness. My eyes snapped open. I wasn't in the forest. I was in the massive bed in the new room, gasping for air, sweat plastering my nightgown to my skin. The room was pitch black, save for a faint light of moonlight slicing through a gap in the heavy curtains. But the sense of a presence wasn't gone. Someone was in the room. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, terrified rhythm. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, my eyes darting around the shadows. Then I saw him. He was standing by the side of the bed, a towering silhouette against the faint light from the window. He was impossibly tall, his shoulders broad enough to block out half the room. Atlas. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, staring down at me in the dark. Terror, cold and sharp, sliced through me. Had he finally snapped? Had the beast won? Was this the moment he finished what he had started that first night? I pressed myself back against the pillows, my body trembling uncontrollably. But he didn't attack. He didn't roar. He just stood there, silent as a statue. And then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, he reached out. His hand, large and powerful enough to crush my skull, hovered in the air just inches above my face. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. I braced myself, waiting for the blow, waiting for the violence. But it didn't come. His hand just hung there in the dark, trembling slightly. And in the scant light, I caught a glimpse of his face. His eyes weren't glowing with murderous rage. They were wide, dark pools of golden light, filled with a chaotic, churning storm of emotions. Confusion, frustration, and something else. Something that looked terrifyingly like torment. Like a man waging a war inside his own skull and losing.
The silence in her room was a lie. It was screaming with her fear, the acrid scent of it coating the back of my throat like ash. I stood over her bed, my hand hovering in the darkness, caught between two warring imperatives that were tearing my sanity apart, thread by bloody thread. Below me, Stella was a pale shape against the dark sheets, gasping from a nightmare I had felt slice through my own consciousness. I had heard her whimper through the thick door separating our rooms, a pathetic, mewling sound that should have disgusted me. Instead, it had yanked on the golden chain welded to my soul with irresistible force. Comfort her. The beast inside me, usually a churning ocean of rage, had surged with a singular, terrifying instinct. Protect. Soothe. But the king, the man who had spent a lifetime building ice around his heart to survive the curse, was appalled. Crush her, my mind countered. Icy and ruthless. She is a weakness made of flesh. Command her silence. So I stood there, paralyzed in the dark, my hand trembling inches above her sweating brow. I wanted to rip the blankets off her, to shake her, until that look of shattered vulnerability left her eyes. I wanted to roar until the walls shook, proving that I was the only monster here worth fearing, not whatever shadows haunted her dreams. Yet, the impulse that had actually moved my arm, the one that had brought my hand to this pathetic hover, was a desperate need to brush the damp hair from her forehead. The sheer repulsiveness of that urge snapped the paralysis. I recoiled as if I'd touched a hot brand, snatching my hand back. The golden light in my eyes, which I knew had dimmed to a treacherous, soft simmer, flared back into a hard burn. Without a word, I turned and stalked out of the room, the heavy door booming shut behind me, like a gavel ending a sentencing. Back in my own chambers, the air felt thin. I paced the length of the stone floor, my boots striking the ground hard enough to send vibrations through the walls. I hated her. I hated her for being weak. I hated her for the way her very existence broadcast my grandfather's sins to the world. But most of all, I hated the sickening relief that washed through my veins whenever I was near her. For 34 years, my life had been a constant, low-grade agony. A crushing pressure on my chest, a fire in my blood that demanded violence to sate it. Then she arrived, the human anchor, and the pain just stopped. It was insidious. It was addictive. Her scent, something inexplicably clean, like rain over dry earth and sweet wildflowers, leaked under the connecting door. My wolf inhaled it greedily, curling up inside me, sedated and calm for the first time in living memory. I was a king nursing an addiction to his own prisoner. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours until dawn sitting in the high-backed chair, facing the adjoining door, hating the wood for being too thick to hear her breathing, and hating myself for straining to hear it at all. By mid-morning, the political fallout of my public display in the council room was already landing on my desk in the form of urgent missives from neighboring territories. Vane had smelled blood. Moving Stella into my quarters had only confirmed his suspicions. The Alpha King had a soft underbelly. I needed to leave the wing. I needed to be seen in the throne room, projecting absolute, unwavering power. But the thought of leaving her unguarded made my molars grind together. The beast paced inside my chest, scratching at the back of my ribs. Mine. Unsafe. Mine. "Greg," I barked, the sound making my beta jump where he stood organizing scrolls by the door. "Yes, Alpha. I'm going to the council chambers. Double the guard on the East Wing corridor. No one in or out without my direct authorization." "Already done, Atlas," Greg said, his tone cautious. He was watching me with the same wary look one might give a loaded cannon that was starting to smoke. "And the girl?" "She stays in her room," I snarled, adjusting the cuffs of my black tunic. The silk felt too tight against my skin. Everything felt too tight. "If she so much as looks at the door, shove her back in." I strode out of my chambers, Greg trailing in my wake. The corridor outside was lined with my personal guard, elite soldiers, men I had bled with, men whose loyalty was absolute. My eyes swept over them, assessing, calculating. They were standing too close to her door. It was an irrational thought. They were standing exactly where they were supposed to. But the wolf didn't deal in rationality. It dealt in territory. As I passed the threshold of Stella's room, the door clicked open. I stopped dead. One of the younger guards, a man named Kalin, Greg's own son, the one I had nearly crippled in the throne room just days ago, had opened the door slightly. He wasn't entering. He was handing something in. A carafe of water. Through the narrow gap, I caught a glimpse of Stella. She looked small and pale, her eyes shadowed from the restless night. She murmured something. A thank you, soft and polite. Kalin nodded. It was a simple, respectful nod. There was no lust in it, no threat, just a soldier acknowledging a guest. For a brief second, his expression softened with something that looked like human pity. Pity. He pitied my mate. The world tilted on its axis. The civilized veneer I wore like a suit of armor, vaporized. A roar tore its way out of my throat, not the booming command of a king, but the jagged, feral snarl of a rival male. Before I was consciously aware of moving, I had crossed the distance. I slammed into Kalin, the sheer force of the impact lifting him off his feet. We crashed into the opposite stone wall, my forearm crushing against his windpipe, pinning him hard enough to crack the stone behind his head. The silver carafe crashed to the floor, shattering, water splashing across my boots. "Atlas!" Greg's voice was a horrified shout somewhere behind me. Kalin's eyes bulged, his face turning a mottled purple as he clawed uselessly at my arm. He was a trained warrior, an alpha in his own right, but against my current fury, he was nothing. "She is not yours to look at," I hissed, my voice a guttural vibration that seemed to come from the center of the earth. My vision swam in a haze of red and gold. The beast wanted blood. It wanted to tear out the throat of this whelp who dared to offer sympathy to what belonged solely to us. "Atlas, stop! You're killing him!" Greg grabbed my shoulder. My wolf perceived it as another attack. I whipped my head around, a warning snarl baring my teeth, ready to strike him down too. The sight of my beta's terrified face, the man who had been a father to me when my own couldn't be, poured ice water over the raging fire. I froze. Kalin was limp against the wall, his eyes rolling back in his head. With a shuddering gasp, I yanked my arm back. Kalin slumped to the floor, coughing raggedly, dragging air into his bruised lungs. Silence fell over the corridor, heavier and more terrifying than the violence itself. The other guards were frozen, staring at me not with reverence, but with stark, naked horror. I looked down at my own hands, They were shaking uncontrollably. I hadn't just wanted to hurt him. I had wanted to end him. Because he looked at her with kindness. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, staggering me back a step. The beast wasn't just awake, it was taking the wheel. And this possessiveness, this violently jealous, irrational obsession, was going to destroy everything I had built. It was going to destroy me. The palace was holding its breath. 24 hours had passed since I nearly snapped the neck of my beta's son in the corridor. The air was thick with unspoken terror. Guards flinched when I walked past. Servants practically flattened themselves against walls to avoid my shadow. Even Greg, the man who had taught me how to hold a sword, wouldn't meet my eyes. I didn't care about their fear. Fear was useful. Fear kept them in line. What I cared about was the suffocating silence from the room next to mine. Since the incident, I had locked the connecting door. I needed barriers. I needed to remember that Stella was a prisoner, a curse manifestation, not something I guarded like a dragon hoarding gold. The beast inside me had been prowling the perimeter of my ribcage, agitated by the separation, scratching at the back of my sternum. I sat at the desk in my chambers, staring at a trade agreement with the Southern Territories without reading a single word. It was midday, bright and clear, but the room felt oppressive. Then it started. It wasn't the old pain, the crushing, icy vice on my heart that had defined my existence before her arrival. This was new. A dull ache settled behind my eyes. My skin felt too tight, prickling with an uncomfortable heat that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. A wave of profound, trembling weakness washed over me, making the quill in my hand feel impossibly heavy. I dropped the quill, a growl building low in my throat. I wasn't sick. Alphas didn't get sick. We healed before viruses could take hold. But the heat intensified. A phantom fever burning through my veins. My joints ached with a sickly throb. It wasn't me. I stood up so fast my heavy chair crashed backward onto the stone floor. I stared at the adjoining door. The scent leaking through the cracks had changed. The crisp, clean smell of rain and wildflowers was gone, replaced by something hot, acrid, and cloying. Sickness. Human sickness. I crossed the room in 2 strides and threw the bolt on the connecting door, slamming it open. The heat in her room hit me like a physical blow. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, yet the air was stifling. Stella was tangled in the center of the massive bed, a small, shuddering lump beneath the heavy duvets. "Stella," I demanded, striding to the bedside. She didn't answer. She was thrashing weakly, her head turning side to side on the pillows. Her skin was an alarming shade of flushed crimson against the white linen, slick with sweat. I reached out, my hand hovering over her forehead, remembering the last time I had done this in the dark. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pressed my palm to her skin. She was burning up. The contact sent a jolt through the bond, a psychic backlash of her delirium and physical misery crashing into my own mind. My knees nearly buckled under the sudden onslaught of her weakness vibrating through my body. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through the shared fever. If she died, the bond broke. And if the bond broke, the ice returned. "Guards!" I roared, the sound shaking the tapestries on the walls. The outer door burst open, 2 guards stumbling over each other in their haste. "Get the healers!" I snarled, not looking away from the fragile creature gasping for air on the bed. "All of them. Now. If they aren't here in 2 minutes, heads will roll." They didn't even salute. They just ran. I ripped the heavy duvet off her, trying to cool her down. She whimpered at the sudden shift in temperature, curling into a tight ball. "It hurts," she mumbled, her voice a cracked whisper that tore at something inside my chest. "What hurts?" I demanded, my voice rough. "Tell me where the injury is." "Everything," she breathed, her eyes squeezing shut. The healers arrived in a terrified flurry of robes and rattling bags. The chief healer, an elderly woman named Sophia who had birthed half the pups in the pack, paled when she saw my face. "Fix her," I commanded, stepping back just enough to let them approach the bed, but hovering close enough that my shadow fell over them. They worked quickly, their hands shaking as they took her temperature, listened to her erratic heart, forced vile-smelling liquids down her throat. Every whimper Stella made felt like a needle driven under my own fingernails. My wolf was pacing frantically, urging me to snatch her away from these strangers prodding at her. "Well?" I demanded, my patience evaporating as Sophia stepped back from the bed. "It is a flu, my king," Sophia stammered, refusing to look me in the eye. "A severe strain, common among humans this time of year. Her constitution is weak from years of the curse's drain." "A flu," I repeated, the words tasting like ashes. "A human illness. Something so mundane, so pathetic, was currently bringing the Alpha King to his knees because he was tied to this fragile little bird. She is burning up," I snarled. "Why is the fever not breaking?" "We have administered herbs to lower her temperature, sire. It will take time. We must keep her cool and hydrated. The danger is, if the fever gets too high, her human body may not withstand the strain." The implication hung in the air. She could die. A low growl vibrated in my chest, making the healers flinch. "If she dies," I said, my voice devoid of inflection, "none of you leave this room alive." Sophia gulped, nodding frantically. "We will do everything, sire. We need cool cloths, fresh water." "Get out," I said suddenly. They froze. "Sire!" "Leave the supplies. Get out." I couldn't handle their fear, their useless fluttering. The scent of their anxiety was mixing with the fever smell, making me nauseous. They didn't argue. They left basins of cool water, stacks of cloths, and rows of glass vials on the bedside table, and fled the room as if escaping a burning building. Silence returned, heavy and hot. I looked down at Stella. She was barely conscious, her breath hitching in shallow gasps. "Keep her alive," my mind hammered. "For the kingdom, for your sanity." I grabbed the basin of water and a cloth. I pulled a chair to the side of the bed, not the far corner this time, but right against the mattress. I wrung out the cloth and placed it on her forehead. She flinched at the cold, a soft moan escaping her cracked lips. "Shh," I found myself saying, the sound foreign on my tongue. "Be still." I spent the next 6 hours in a personal hell. I replaced the clothes as soon as her burning skin heated them. I drizzled water between her lips, forcing her to swallow. Every time her temperature spiked, I felt it in my own blood, a wave of dizzying heat that made the room spin. I hated this. I hated the vulnerability of it. I hated that my massive, scarred hands, which had broken bones and wielded executioner's swords, were now performing acts of gentle servitude for a human girl. But I couldn't stop. The impulse to leave, to let the servants handle this, died the moment it formed. My wolf wouldn't allow it. Mine to guard, mine to keep alive. Around midnight, the fever began to crest. Her thrashing grew wilder. She started murmuring names I didn't know, pleading with unseen phantoms. "Please, no, don't take me." "You are safe," I said gruffly, replacing the cloth on her neck. It was a lie, of course. She was in the Alpha King's palace. She was never safe. Her eyes snapped open. They were glassy, unfocused, seeing things that weren't there. She looked frantically around the shadowy room until her gaze landed on me. I tensed, waiting for the scream, waiting for the terror she always showed when I was near. But she didn't scream. Her hand shot out from under the light sheet. It was small, hot, and trembling violently. Before I could react, her fingers wrapped around my wrist. Her grip was weak, pathetic really, a child's grasp. Yet it held me faster than iron chains. She tried to pull me closer, her eyes frantic, searching my face through the haze of delirium. "Please," she whispered, the word barely more than a breath of hot air. "Don't leave me alone in the dark." The plea hit me harder than any physical blow I had ever taken on a battlefield. It was a raw, naked need. I stared at her hand on my wrist. My skin burned where she touched me, a sensation that had nothing to do with the fever. The king in me roared to pull away, to establish dominance, to reject this weakness. She is a tool, a prisoner. Do not let her think she can command you. But the beast whimpered. Slowly, stiffly, my other hand moved. It covered hers, my large fingers engulfing her small ones. I didn't pull away. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, anchoring myself to the side of her bed. "I'm not going anywhere," I murmured into the oppressive heat of the room. I sat there through the dead of night, the ruthless king, holding the hand of a delirious human girl, because the terrifying truth was, I wasn't sure I could survive letting go. The fever broke just before dawn. I woke with a start, my neck stiff against the hard wood of the chair. The first thing I registered was the silence. The ragged, desperate gasping had stopped, replaced by soft, even breathing. The second thing I registered was the weight in my hand. I looked down. My large, scarred hand was still covering hers on the mattress. During the night, her fingers had curled around my thumb, holding on like a lifeline. The sight of it, that stark, undeniable evidence of my own weakness, sent a jolt of revulsion through me. Not at her, at myself. I snatched my hand back as if her skin had turned to acid. The movement was violent enough to rouse her. Stella's eyelids fluttered open. The glassy haze of delirium was gone, replaced by the clear, honey-brown depths that always seemed to see too much. She blinked, orienting herself, her gaze traveling from her own empty hand to my face. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the room. It wasn't the terrified silence of before. It was thicker, charged with the memory of the heat, the whispering, the sheer pathetic need that had filled the space between us hours ago. She remembered. I saw the flush rise on her pale cheeks, not from fever this time, but from awareness. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. My jaw tightened until my teeth ached. "Do not read into things that are not there," I grated out. Standing up so abruptly, the chair screeched against the stone floor. "You dying is an inconvenience to the kingdom, nothing more." The lie tasted like bile. My wolf snarled in protest, hating the distance, hating the cold mask I slammed back into place. Hours. Hurt. Protect. I ignored the beast. I turned my back on her, needing to escape the scent of sickness and the far more dangerous scent of vulnerability. "Get cleaned up. You smell like death." I stalked through the connecting door into my own chambers and bolted it shut. I leaned against the heavy wood, breathing hard, feeling like I had just fought a battalion single-handedly. The physical link of the fever was gone, but something worse had taken its place. An acknowledgement. A shared secret. I had seen her weakest moment, and God help me, she had seen mine. 2 days passed. The air in the adjoining rooms remained thick with unspoken things. Stella recovered with frustrating slowness. Her human fragility, a constant irritation. I kept the door bolted, but I found myself standing by it constantly, listening for the soft sounds of her moving around, my wolf settling only when I could confirm her presence. Then, the real world crashed back in. I was in the war room, the large stone table covered in maps of the northern territories, when the messenger arrived. He was bloodied, his horse ridden nearly to death. "Alpha," he gasped, dropping to one knee. "The Vargar Pass. Vane's forces hit it at dawn." A collective growl rippled through my council members gathered around the table. The Vargar Pass was a crucial trade route, but it was also notoriously difficult to navigate. We kept it lightly guarded because the terrain itself was a deterrent. "How did they get through the ravines without triggering the scouts?" Greg asked, leaning over the map, his brow furrowed. The messenger swallowed hard. "They didn't take the ravines, Beta. They came through the old mining tunnels." Silence fell over the room. Absolute, deathly silence. "The mining tunnels," I said, my voice dangerously low, "were sealed 50 years ago. Their locations are not on any public map." "They knew exactly where the entrance shafts were, sire," the messenger whispered. "And they knew exactly when the shift change happened for the skeleton crew guarding that sector." I stared at the map, the red ink marking Vane's incursion, burning into my retinas. They hadn't just gotten lucky. This wasn't brute force. This was precision. "Out," I said. The council members hesitated. "Everyone out," I roared, slamming my fist onto the stone table, hard enough to crack the thick slab. "Now!" They scattered like frightened prey. Only Greg remained, standing on the other side of the broken table, his expression grim. "It's a leak, Atlas," he said quietly. "Someone high up gave Vane those schematics. Someone who has access to the Royal Archives." I didn't look at him. My mind was racing, connecting dots that formed a picture I didn't want to see. Vane's sudden boldness in the throne room, his taunts about Stella, and now, a surgical strike designed to humiliate me, to show that my borders, my territory, were porous. Vane knew. He knew about the curse. He knew about Stella. He knew I was distracted, unbalanced, spending my nights nursing a human instead of ruling my kingdom. And someone inside these walls had confirmed it for him. My blood went cold, then boiling hot. The wolf surged, a tide of black, paranoid fury. "Who has access, Greg?" I turned slowly to face my beta, the man who had stood by my side since I took the throne, the man whose son had looked at my mate with pity. Greg blinked. "The council elders, the archivists, me, you." My eyes narrowed into golden slits. The beast was whispering terrible things. Betrayal. Close. Too close. "And who?" I asked, stepping around the table, my voice a silky thread of menace. "Has been questioning my judgment lately? Who has been looking at the human in the East Wing with softness in their eyes?" Greg's face went slack with shock. "Atlas, you cannot possibly think—" "Vane didn't just guess," I snarled, stalking toward him. The air in the room crackled with my released aura, heavy and suffocating. He knew I was weak. He knew exactly where to hit to prove it. Someone told him. "I have served your family for 40 years, Greg said, his voice trembling with indignation, holding his ground, even as my shadow engulfed him. "I would sooner cut out my own tongue than betray you." "Would you?" I stopped inches from him, looming over him. "Or do you think I'm unfit? Do you think the curse has finally broken me? and you need to save the kingdom from its mad king by helping Vane replace me? That is insanity speaking, Atlas. Listen to yourself. I am listening, I roared back in his face. I am listening to the fact that my borders are bleeding because someone in this palace is a traitor, and I am done trusting anyone. The accusation hung between us, irrevocable. I saw the light die in Greg's eyes, the respect, the paternal affection, replaced by a cold, hard wall of hurt. Very well, Alpha, he said formally, stepping back. If my loyalty is in question, I will confine myself to quarters until you find the true culprit. He turned and walked out of the war room, his shoulders stiff. I watched him go, the silence of the room ringing in my ears. I had just shattered my oldest alliance. I was utterly alone. But as the door clicked shut, a terrifying clarity settled over me. The wolf stopped pacing. If Greg could be doubted, if the man who was practically my father could be suspect, then no one was safe. No guard, no servant, no healer. Vane wanted Stella. He knew she was the key to breaking me, and there were snakes in my own walls waiting to hand her to him. I strode out of the war room, not toward my chambers, but toward the armory. I was done outsourcing her safety. I was done pretending I could keep her at arm's length. If the world wanted to use her against me, they would have to go through me first. Literally. From now on, the girl didn't leave my sight. Ever. Trust was a luxury I could no longer afford. I had banished Greg, the closest thing I had to family, to his quarters. The palace, once my fortress, now felt like a viper's nest, every shadow concealing a potential traitor bought by Vane's gold. And right in the center of it was Stella, the target. I couldn't leave her. The thought of riding out to the border and leaving her unguarded, even surrounded by my elite guard, made my wolf claw frantically at the back of my ribcage. If the traitor was inside the walls, she was safer in the open field with me than locked in her gilded cage. Besides, Vane wanted to paint me as weak. Hiding her away only fed that narrative. Parading her, showing that the king feared nothing, was the only political move left. We ride at dawn, I had told the captain of the guard, ignoring the flicker of surprise in his eyes when I added, and the girl comes with me. The pre-dawn air in the stables was biting cold, smelling of hay, leather, and the nervous sweat of horses sensing their riders' tension. Stella stood by a mounting block, wrapped in a thick wool cloak I'd ordered for her, looking ridiculously small against the backdrop of war-ready destriers. She didn't protest when I approached. She didn't look well, fully recovered from the fever, but still possessing that infuriating aura of fragility. "You're riding with me," I said, not making it a question. I wasn't about to put her on her own horse where she could be snatched or, worse, try to run. I swung up into the saddle of my massive black stallion, Ares, then reached down. She hesitated only a fraction of a second before taking my forearm. I hauled her up in one easy motion, settling her in front of me. The contact was instantaneous and electric. My thighs bracketed hers. Her back was pressed against my chest, separated only by layers of wool and leather armor. Her scent, that damnable clean, sweet rain smell, washed over me, cutting through the stable odors. My wolf purred, a deep vibrating sound in my chest that I hoped she couldn't feel. Close, safe, ours. "Hold on," I grumbled, taking the reins around her waist. My arms formed a cage around her. We rode out in a column of 20 guards, the rhythmic pounding of hooves the only sound breaking the morning silence. The journey to the Vargar Pass was grueling, the terrain turning from rolling hills to jagged, unforgiving rock. For 4 hours, I existed in a state of hyper-awareness that was agony. Every shift of her weight, Every intake of breath registered against my body. I hated it. I hated that my focus, which should have been entirely on scanning the ridges for threats, kept snapping back to the curve of her neck right in front of my mouth. When we reached the border site, the stench of old smoke and dried blood still clung to the air. The entrance to the old mining tunnels, the breach Vane had exploited, was a jagged scar in the cliff face, surrounded by the broken bodies of the few guards who had been stationed there. I dismounted, then lifted Stella down. Her legs wobbled as she hit the ground. "Stay right here," I ordered, pointing to a spot near Aries' flank, surrounded by my personal guard. "Do not move." I walked to the tunnel entrance, crouching to examine the tracks. The anger that had been simmering since the messenger arrived boiled over. They hadn't just breached the border. They had butchered my men and left them to rot as a message. Vane was going to pay in blood. I was tracing the claw marks on the stone, calculating the size of the attack force, when the wind shifted. It brought a scent that didn't belong. Not pine, not rock, not decay. Wolf. Foreign. Too many. "Ambush!" I roared, drawing the broadsword at my hip just as the first arrow hissed through the air, embedding itself in the dirt inches from my boot. Chaos erupted. From the ridge above the tunnel entrance, gray and brown shapes poured down like an avalanche. Vane's mercenaries. Shifters who sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. They slammed into my guard line with feral viciousness. I didn't have time to think. I became the weapon the kingdom needed. I waded into the fray, my broadsword a blur of steel. I wasn't fighting with technique. I was fighting with rage. Every swing cleaved armor and bone. I decapitated one attacker, gutted another with a backhanded slice, and shattered the knee of a third with a kick that cracked like thunder. My beast was close to the surface, lending strength to my blows, roaring in my head. The air grew thick with the copper tang of fresh blood. Throughout the carnage, a sliver of my attention remained locked on the cluster of guards near Ares. Stella was there, huddled low, her hands over her ears. We were winning. My guard was elite, and I was a force of nature when unleashed. The mercenaries were beginning to break, turning to flee back up the ridge. I drove my sword through the chest of the last attacker near me, wrenching it free with a sickening crunch. I turned, chest heaving, adrenaline coursing through my veins like liquid fire, to check on Stella. She was standing now, looking at the carnage with wide, horrified eyes. The guards around her were catching their breath, lowering their weapons slightly. Movement caught my eye. High on the ridge to the east, a flash of sunlight on metal. My eyes snapped up. A lone archer. He wasn't aiming at the soldiers. He wasn't aiming at me. The arrow was already loosed. Time seemed to warp. I saw the shaft arcing through the air, a death sentence tipped in steel. I saw its trajectory with terrifying mathematical certainty. It was heading straight for Stella's heart. There was no time to shout a warning. No time to command the guards to move. There was only instinct. The raw, undeniable imperative that had taken root in my soul the moment she walked into my throne room. I threw myself forward. I didn't feel my feet leave the ground. I only felt the desperate need to put mass between the threat and the target. I hit her hard, slamming my body against hers, spinning us around just as the arrow struck with a wet thwack. It didn't hit the armor. It found the gap between my shoulder plate and my neck, burying itself deep in the heavy muscle of my trap. The pain was a blinding white flash that buckled my knees. I grunted, staggering, but I didn't let go of her. My arms remained locked around her waist, shielding her from a threat that had already landed. The world spun. I looked down. Stella was staring up at me, her face inches from mine, her eyes wide with shock. She wasn't hurt. I looked down at my shoulder. The black fletching of the arrow protruded from my flesh. Hot blood was already soaking my tunic, dripping onto her cloak. My vision wavered, black spots dancing at the edges. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a searing agony that radiated down my arm and up into my skull. I looked back at her. The shock in her eyes was turning to dawning horror as she realized whose blood was coating her. "You," she whispered, her hands hovering over the wound, afraid to touch. I wanted to speak, to tell her to stay down, to order the guards to find the archer. But my jaw was locked against the pain. I just stared at her, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the golden fire in my eyes dimming with pain. I had spent weeks telling myself she was nothing but a burden, a weakness. Yet here I stood, an arrow buried in my flesh that had been meant for her, proving to the world and to myself that the ruthless king would bleed to keep his prison alive.
The world had narrowed to the smell of copper and the horrific wet sound of the arrow impacting flesh. I stared, paralyzed, at the black fletching protruding from Atlas's shoulder. Blood, impossibly bright and hot, soaked the dark wool of his tunic and dripped onto my own cloak. It didn't make sense. The angle was wrong. The arrow had come from high up on the ridge. It should have buried itself in my chest. It should have stopped the curse, stopped the pain, stopped everything. Instead, it was in him, because he had moved. The realization hit me harder than the physical impact of his body slamming into mine moments before. The ruthless king, the man who looked at me with open loathing every day, had thrown himself into the path of a kill shot meant for me. "Atlas!" My voice was a pathetic squeak. He didn't look at me. His jaw was locked so tightly the muscles leaped in his cheek. A guttural snarl ripped from his throat, a sound that belonged entirely to the beast. With a sickening crack, he reached up with his opposite hand and snapped the arrow shaft off, leaving the arrowhead buried deep in his muscle. He didn't even flinch. "Mount up!" he roared at the remaining guards, his voice thick with pain and fury. Before I could process the order, his good arm wrapped around my waist like an iron band. He didn't lift me this time. He hauled me up onto the horse's saddle with bruising force, swinging up behind me a second later. The ride that followed was a blur of terror. We didn't head back towards the palace. Atlas turned the horse off the main road, plunging deep into the dense, rocky forest bordering the Varga Pass. He rode with reckless desperation, the great stallion leaping over fallen logs and scrambling up shale slopes. I was plastered against his chest. I could feel the heat radiating from his wound, searing through our layers of clothing. Every time the horse landed hard, a jolt of agony ripped through the bond between us, a white-hot spike in my own shoulder that made me gasp. He was bleeding out against my back, and he was riding like the hounds of hell were snapping at his heels. "Where are we going?" I yelled over the wind rushing past my ears. He didn't answer. He just kicked the horse faster, his arm tightening around my ribs until I could barely breathe. We stopped abruptly in a narrow ravine, hidden by overhanging conifers. There was nothing here but rock and shadow. Atlas slid off the horse, landing heavily, and immediately pulled me down. He didn't let go of my arm. He dragged me toward the cliff face, pushing aside a curtain of heavy ivy to reveal a heavy iron door set directly into the stone. "Secure the ridge," he barked at the captain of the guard who had managed to keep up. "No one gets within a mile of this location. Kill anything that moves that isn't wearing my crest." "Sire, your shoulder." "Go!" Atlas roared, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. He kicked the iron door open and shoved me inside. It wasn't a room. It was a bunker. The air was stale and cold, smelling of damp earth and unused weaponry. It was a single, cramped stone chamber buried in the hillside, lit only by thin slivers of light coming through narrow ventilation slits near the ceiling. There was a cot in the corner, a rack of dusty swords, and a heavy wooden table. Atlas slammed the iron door shut, plunging us into near darkness. The heavy clang sounded like the closing of a tomb. He leaned back against the door, his chest heaving. In the dim light, his eyes glowed with a terrifying, feral luminescence. The scent in the small room became suffocating intensely. The metallic tang of fresh blood mixed with the overwhelming, musky scent of an enraged alpha wolf. My heart hammered against my ribs. The adrenaline in the room was thick enough to taste. It was violent, volatile, and strangely, confusingly charged with something else. I backed away slowly until my spine hit the cold stone wall opposite him. "Atlas, you're hurt badly. We need a healer." "Shut up," he snarled, pushing off the door. He staggered slightly, then righted himself with a furious shake of his head. He began to pace the small confines of the bunker like a tiger newly crated. 3 steps one way, turn, 3 steps back. A low, continuous growl rumbled deep in his chest. He kept flexing the fingers of his injured arm, testing the damage, wincing only slightly as fresh blood welled around the broken arrow shaft. The bond was a chaotic storm in my head. I felt his searing pain, yes, but it was drowned out by a tidal wave of blind, destructive fury. And underneath the fury, terrifying possession. Mine, nearly lost. Mine. He stopped pacing abruptly in the center of the room, his glowing eyes locking onto me in the shadows. "Did they touch you?" His voice was rough, barely human. I shook my head frantically. "No. No one got close. You stopped them." It wasn't the right answer. He crossed the distance between us in 2 strides, moving faster than a wounded man should be able to move. He crowded me against the wall, his massive frame blocking out the meager light. His breathing was ragged and hot against my face. "Where are you hurt?" he demanded. "I'm not," I whispered, pressing myself flat against the stone, terrified by the sheer intensity radiating from him. "I'm fine. You're the one with an arrow in your shoulder." He ignored me. His hands, hot and blood-stained, grabbed my shoulders. It wasn't gentle. It was a desperate, frantic pat-down. He ran his hands down my arms, gripping my biceps hard enough to bruise, checked my ribs, my hips. It felt predatory, invasive, yet the bond hummed with a frantic need to ensure I was whole. He was checking for breaks, for cuts, for anything that might have slipped past his defense. "They aimed for your heart," he breathed, the words sounding like they were torn from his throat. His hands moved up to my neck, his thumbs tracing the pulse points there, pressing hard enough to feel the frantic rhythm of my blood. "Atlas, stop," I gasped, his proximity overwhelming me. The smell of him, blood, sweat, and raw male power filled my senses. He didn't stop. His hands tangled in my hair, gripping the strands near the roots, tilting my head back against the stone wall so I had to look up at him. His face was inches from mine. His golden eyes were dilated, almost entirely black, swirling with violence and adrenaline and something else, something starving. His gaze dropped to my lips. My breath hitched. The air in the bunker seemed to vanish. I could feel the heat of his body, the hard planes of his chest pressing against mine. I knew I should be terrified. He was a hair's breadth away from snapping, from letting the wolf take over completely. But the bond... God help me, the bond wasn't screaming in fear. It was screaming in recognition. It was pulling me toward him, sparking a terrifying answering heat low in my belly. He leaned closer. His nose brushed against my cheek, inhaling deeply, shuddering as he took in my scent. It was a savage, intimate gesture. He was on the precipice, teetering between violence and a different kind of hunger entirely. He almost did it. I saw the impulse war in his eyes. He almost crushed his mouth to mine, not in affection but in a desperate need to consume, to mark, to prove I was still here. Then, with a roar of frustration that shook the dust from the ceiling, he ripped himself away from me. He slammed his uninjured fist into the stone wall next to my head, cracking the mortar. "Don't move," he snarled at me, turning his back and resuming his frantic caged pacing. "Don't you dare move from that spot." The stone wall dug into my back, cold and unyielding. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The air in the small, stale bunker felt charged, vibrating with the raw, chaotic energy radiating from him. He paced, a caged predator. Every movement was jerky and fueled by an anger that seemed almost tangible. His injured arm hung slightly limp at his side, blood staining the dark fabric of his tunic in a spreading crimson bloom. Each step he took sent a jolt of dull, throbbing pain through the bond, a persistent echo of his injury in my own shoulder. It was maddening. The pain, yes, but also the sight of him like this, so powerful, yet so consumed by his own turbulent emotions. "Atlas," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it seemed to slice through the thick silence of the bunker. He didn't stop pacing, didn't even acknowledge me. He just kept moving, his eyes fixed on the far wall, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. I couldn't just stand there. The pain radiating from him was a constant, gnawing ache, and the sight of his blood was making me sick. I pushed myself off the wall, my legs trembling slightly, and took a step toward him. "Atlas!" I said again, louder this time, taking another step. He whirled around. The movement was so sudden, so violent, that I gasped, instinctively throwing my hands up as if to ward off a blow. I stumbled back, my heel catching on the uneven stone floor. I would have fallen if he hadn't caught me. His hand shot out, grabbing my upper arm to steady me. It was his injured arm. A gasp ripped from my throat as a blinding white flash of agony exploded in my shoulder. The bond amplified his pain 100-fold, transmitting the raw, searing sensation of the arrowhead tearing through muscle and sinew directly to me. He didn't even flinch. His grip on my arm was like iron, unyielding and devoid of any sign of the pain I knew he must be feeling. His golden eyes burned into mine, dark and intense. "I told you not to move," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous, vibrating through my bones. I looked up at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. The fear was there, yes, but beneath it, a spark of defiance ignited. "You're such a fine man," I retorted, my voice trembling slightly, but gaining strength with each word. "To let anger take control over you like this." His eyes narrowed, the gold irises seeming to swirl with a mixture of surprise and fury. His grip on my arm tightened slightly, just enough to be a warning. "You think this is anger?" he growled, leaning closer, his breath hot on my face. "This is restraint, Stella. This is me not tearing this mountain apart stone by stone to find the coward who loosed that arrow." I didn't back down. I couldn't. The pain in my shoulder was a constant, throbbing reminder of why I was doing this. "Come on," I said, placing my free hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. I could feel the powerful, thudding rhythm beneath the layers of leather and wool. I pushed gently, trying to create some space between us. "You're bleeding a lot. Let me help you." He looked down at my hand on his chest, his expression unreadable. For a moment I thought he was going to snap at me, to order me back against the wall. "You think you can help me?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "A human girl against an alpha's wound?" "I am doing it for myself," I shot back, my voice rising with frustration. "Because the pain is killing me. I might pass out any moment from now on if you don't let me do something." He stared at me for a beat, his gaze intense and searching. Then, slowly, the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease just a fraction. "Fine," he grunted, releasing my arm. "Sit," I ordered, pointing to the small cot in the corner. "I can't do anything when you're towering over me like that." He let out a short, humorless laugh, but he turned and walked over to the cot, lowering his massive frame onto the thin mattress with a grimace that he quickly masked. I followed him, my heart still pounding. "Take off that hard royal heavy stuff you're wearing," I said, gesturing to his leather armor and the blood-soaked tunic beneath it. He looked at me for a long moment, his golden eyes inscrutable. Then, without a word, he began to unbuckle the leather straps of his armor. His movements were stiff and jerky, hindered by his injury, but he managed to remove the heavy pieces, letting them fall to the stone floor with a clatter. Next came the tunic. He pulled it over his head with a hiss of pain, his face pale beneath the grime and blood. I tried not to stare, I really did. But as the tunic fell away, revealing his broad, sculpted chest, my breath hitched in my throat. He was magnificent. Every muscle was defined, etched with a raw, untamed power that was both terrifying and captivating. The dark hair dusting his chest narrowed down to a taut abdomen, and the smooth, bronze skin was marred only by a few old scars and the fresh, angry wound on his shoulder. It was perfection, a masterpiece of masculine strength and beauty. "Is this your first time watching a man's chest?" His deep voice jerked me out of my trance. I snapped my eyes up to his face, heat flooding my cheeks. His golden eyes were glinting with amusement, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. I looked away, bending down to examine the wound to hide my embarrassment. "I'm going to pull this thing out," I said, my voice tight, ignoring his question because the answer was a humiliating yes. "And it's going to hurt." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound in his chest. "Have you ever done this before?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "No," I admitted, taking a deep breath and gripping the broken arrow shaft firmly. "But I've read about it." Before he could protest, before I could lose my nerve, I pulled. Hard. A guttural roar tore from his throat, echoing off the stone walls of the bunker. His entire body seized up, his muscles bunching and coiling in agony. I felt a corresponding spike of white-hot pain flare through the bond, so intense that it brought tears to my eyes. The arrowhead came free with a sickening squelch, followed by a fresh gush of dark blood. I dropped the bloody arrowhead onto the floor and immediately reached for the hem of my dress, intending to tear a strip of fabric to bind the wound. I tugged at the thick material, but it wouldn't budge. My hands were shaking, my strength sapped by the adrenaline and the shared pain. "Damn it!" I cursed under my breath, frustration mounting. "Here," Atlas growled, his voice rough with pain. He reached out with his good hand and grabbed the hem of my dress, pulling me closer until I was standing between his spread legs. He leaned forward, his face inches from my thigh, and took the fabric in his teeth. With a sharp jerk of his head and a powerful tug of his hand, he ripped a long strip of cloth from the dress with a loud tearing sound. I stared at him, wide-eyed, taken aback by the raw, primal display of strength. He handed me the strip of cloth, his golden eyes meeting mine. "Finish it," he said, his voice low. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my throat. I took the cloth and began to wrap it tightly around his shoulder, trying to ignore the way his muscles jumped and twitched beneath my touch, trying to ignore the intense heat radiating from his skin, trying to ignore the fact that I was standing between the legs of the most powerful, terrifying man I had ever met, binding his wounds with a piece of my own clothing. When I was finished, I tied the knot firmly and stepped back, my hands covered in his blood. "That should help," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "until you see the real healer." The ride back to the palace was a blur of exhausted silence. Atlas didn't speak. He rode with a grim, terrifying focus, his injured arm bound tightly against his chest. I sat in front of him, the heat of his body a stark contrast to the icy distance that had settled between us the moment we left the bunker. The bond was a muted throb of dull pain, his physical agony dampened by a wall of iron control. But beneath it I felt something else, a cold, hard emptiness that frightened me more than his rage ever had. When we finally rode into the palace courtyard, it was chaos. Guards swarmed, shouts echoing against the stone walls. Greg was there, his face pale with worry, shouting orders for healers. Atlas dismounted, then lifted me down without a word. His touch was impersonal, mechanical. He didn't look at me. He didn't check to see if I was all right. He simply turned and strode toward the palace entrance, a dark, formidable figure surrounded by a phalanx of guards. "Atlas!" I called out, taking a step to follow him, but Greg intercepted me. "My lady," he said, his voice tight with concern, "are you hurt?" I shook my head, my eyes fixed on Atlas's retreating back. "No, but he is. The arrow." "The healers are with him," Greg assured me, gently steering me toward the residential wing. "You need rest, Stella. You've been through a terrible ordeal." I let him lead me away, too exhausted to argue. But as I was ushered into my chambers, a profound sense of unease settled over me. The silence from Atlas felt wrong. It felt final. The next few days were a study in isolation. I was confined to my wing, ostensibly for my own safety. but it felt like a punishment. No one would tell me how Atlas was doing. The guards stationed outside my door were stone-faced and silent. Even Greg, when he finally came to see me, was evasive. "The king is recovering," he said, refusing to meet my eyes. "He has much on his mind. The attack." "He's ignoring me," I said flatly. Greg sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Stella, you must understand. What happened? It was unprecedented. The king is adjusting. Adjusting. That was one word for it." I spent my days pacing my rooms, the silence amplifying the strange emptiness in the bond. It was as if Atlas had severed the connection, walled himself off completely. I couldn't feel his anger, his pain, or even that terrifying possessive pull that had become so familiar. It was agonizing. Not because I missed the pain, but because I realized with a jolt of horror that I missed him. I missed the intense way he looked at me, as if he wanted to devour me and protect me at the same time. I missed the low rumble of his voice, even when he was growling threats. I missed the terrifying, exhilarating awareness of his presence that had become a constant in my life. He had saved me. He had taken an arrow for me, and now he was freezing me out. I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was suffocating. The not knowing was worse than his fury. On the fourth day, I snapped. I waited until the guard change, when there was a brief window of distraction. I slipped out of my room and hurried down the corridor, my heart pounding in my throat. I knew exactly where he would be. The royal study. The guards outside the massive doors looked surprised to see me, but they didn't stop me. Perhaps they knew better than to stand between the king and his curse. I pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The study was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and the faint metallic tang of blood that seemed to cling to Atlas now. He was standing by the fireplace, his back to me, staring into the flames. His injured arm was in a sling, but otherwise he looked imposing and untouchable as ever. He didn't turn around. "Get out," he growled, his voice low and rough. "No," I said, my voice trembling but firm. I walked further into the room, closing the door behind me with a definitive click. He turned then, slowly, deliberately. His golden eyes were cold, devoid of any emotion. It was like looking into a void. I said, "Get out, Stella." "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, stopping a few feet away from him. "You haven't spoken to me in days. You won't even look at me." He let out a short, harsh laugh. "And why should I? You're a liability, Stella. A weakness. You're nothing but a burden." His words were like physical blows. They were meant to hurt, to push me away. But I saw the slight tremor in his jaw, the way his hand clenched into a fist at his side. "That's a lie," I said, taking another step closer. "You saved me. You took an arrow for me." His eyes narrowed. "A tactical error, one I won't repeat." "It wasn't an error," I insisted, my voice rising. "You didn't even think about it. It was instinct. You protected me because—" I trailed off, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "Because you care." He flinched as if I had struck him. The cold mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of raw, naked agony in his eyes. Then the rage took over. He crossed the distance between us in 2 long strides, grabbing my shoulders. It wasn't gentle. His grip was bruising, desperate. He shook me, his face contorted with fury. "You think this is affection?" he snarled, his voice a guttural roar. "You think this is caring?" He shoved me back, not hard enough to make me fall, but enough to create space between us. He paced away, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of sheer frustration. "This," he spat, gesturing between us, "is a curse. It's a disease. You are my prison, Stella. You are the cage that binds me, the weakness that will destroy me." His words echoed in the silent room, brutal and unforgiving. My heart ached for him, for the tormented beast trapped inside the man. I didn't back down. I couldn't. I walked up to him, slowly, deliberately. He watched me, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. I stopped inches from him and reached out, placing my hand flat over his heart. I could feel it pounding beneath my palm, a frantic, powerful rhythm that defied his cold words. "Then why," I whispered, looking up into his tortured eyes, "does this beat only for me?" For a heartbeat, the world existed only in the frantic rhythm beating beneath my palm. His heart hammered against my hand, a wild, caged thing that betrayed every icy word that had just left his mouth. Then he broke. Not into rage, not into passion, but into a horrifying recoil. Atlas ripped himself away from my touch, as if my skin were branded with white-hot iron. He stumbled back until he hit the heavy desk, his breath coming in harsh, shallow rasps. His golden eyes, moments ago swirling with tortured conflict, went completely dead. It was like watching a door slam shut in the deepest part of his soul. "Get out," he whispered. The sound was hollow, drained of all inflection. It was far more terrifying than his roar. I opened my mouth to argue, to fight for the sliver of ground I thought I'd gained, but the look on his face stopped me cold. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking through me, into some abyss I couldn't see. The bond between us, usually a humming live wire of shared sensation, went disturbingly numb. It felt like he had chemically severed the connection, drugging himself into oblivion to escape the reality of us. I left. I had no choice. The days that followed were a suffocating study in absence. Atlas didn't just withdraw, he vanished within the walls of his own palace. He spent his nights in the war room and his days drilling the guard until they dropped from exhaustion. He never came to our wing. He never summoned me. The bond remained a dead weight in my chest, a muted throb that only registered his physical location like a faint compass needle, devoid of all emotion. He was walling me out, starving the connection until it withered. He was trying to prove his own lie, that I was just a burden, easily ignored. But I knew the truth now. I had felt his heart. I had seen the agony in his eyes when he took that arrow. He didn't hate me. He hated that he needed me. And while he was busy fighting himself, the real threat was closing in. The ambush at the border hadn't been random. Vane had known exactly where we would be. That kind of intelligence didn't come from lucky guesses. It came from inside the palace. Atlas was too consumed by his internal war to see the rot spreading right under his nose. If he wouldn't protect himself, I would have to do it for him. I realized quickly that my greatest weakness in this wolf kingdom was also my greatest strength. I was utterly insignificant. To the guards, the servants, and the high-ranking officials, I was furniture. I was the king's unfortunate human baggage, easily overlooked and rarely acknowledged. I became a ghost in the palace halls. I started small, lingering in alcoves near the council chambers, polishing the same decorative suit of armor for an hour, just to overhear snippets of conversation. I learned the rhythms of the palace, the shift changes, the times when the corridors were empty. The bond, numb as it was useful. I always knew where Atlas was, which meant I always knew where he wasn't. It took 3 days of shadowing to narrow down the suspects. Greg was loyal to a fault. His anxiety over Atlas was genuine. The captain of the guard was too simple-minded for high treason. He lived and breathed orders. My focus shifted to the Council of Elders. They were old wolves, traditionalists who despised that their glorious Alpha King was shackled to a weak human creature. I'd seen the looks of disdain they cast my way when they thought I wasn't looking. On the 4th afternoon, opportunity knocked. A full council session was called to discuss the increasing aggression from Vane's border territories. Atlas would be occupied for hours in the main chamber, his focus entirely on the map table. The council members' private offices, located in a wing adjacent to the main chamber, would be empty. My heart hammered against my ribs, a nervous human rhythm, as I slipped past the distracted guards at the entrance to the council wing. I wore a plain servant's dress I'd pilfered from the laundry, keeping my head down, carrying a stack of folded linens as a prop. No one stopped me. No one even looked twice. The corridor was silent, smelling of beeswax, old parchment, and the faint underlying musk of fur. I moved quickly, trying the doors. Most were locked. The third door, belonging to Councilman Seth, the oldest and most vocal critic of the human cure, was not. I slipped inside and eased the heavy door shut behind me, plunging the room into semi-darkness. It was a stuffy space, cluttered with heavy furniture and shelves bursting with scrolls. I didn't have much time. I dumped the linens on a chair and started searching. I rifled through the papers on his massive desk. Tax reports, grain requisitions, mundane administrative nonsense. Nothing. I checked the bookshelves, pulling out volumes and feeling behind them for hidden recesses. Nothing. Panic began to prick at the back of my neck. The council session wouldn't last forever. I turned back to the desk, frustration mounting. I gripped the edge of the heavy wood, ready to shove it aside in a fit of pique, when I felt it. A slight ridge underneath the decorative carving on the side panel. I pressed it. With a soft click, a shallow drawer sprang open, cleverly concealed in the desk's moulding. My breath hitched. Inside lay a single rolled parchment sealed with black wax. The insignia pressed into the wax wasn't the Alpha King's crest. It was a crude, jagged depiction of a broken wolf's jaw. Vane's sigil. My hands trembled so badly I could barely break the seal. I unrolled the parchment, my eyes scanning the hurried, sprawling script. It was a message from Vane, dated 2 days before the ambush. Seth, your intelligence regarding the border inspection was precise. My mercenaries are in position at the gorge. We will draw the Alpha out. Remember the objective. Do not engage Atlas directly, unless necessary. The target is the human. Put an arrow in her heart, and the king falls to his knees. Without his anchor, he will consume himself. The kingdom will be ours for the taking. V. The room spun. It was all there in black and white. The ambush, the specific targeting of me, the ultimate plan to drive Atlas mad with grief and pain so they could usurp the throne. Seth wasn't just a disgruntled traditionalist. He was a traitor of the highest order. I had to get this to Atlas. He wouldn't believe me without proof, but this was irrefutable. I rolled the parchment tight, clutching it in my sweating palm like a lifeline. I grabbed the stack of linens, turning toward the door, adrenaline surging through my veins. I needed to get out, find Greg, find anyone loyal. The heavy brass doorknob turned. I froze, trapped between the desk and the wall, the damning evidence burning a hole in my hand. There was nowhere to hide. The door creaked open, letting in a swath of bright hallway light that cut through the dusty gloom of the office. Councilman Seth stood in the doorway. He was a tall, spare man with greying temples and eyes like chips of flint. He stopped short, his gaze darting from the discarded linens on the chair to me, huddled by his desk. His eyes dropped to my hand, to the rolled parchment bearing the black seal. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the terrified thudding of my own heart. Seth's expression shifted instantly from surprise to a cold, predatory sneer. He stepped inside, closing the heavy door behind him with a decisive, echoing thud. I heard the distinct sound of a deadbolt sliding home. "Well, well," Seth said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, shedding the veneer of the civilized councilman to reveal the wolf beneath. "It seems the little mouse has learned how to squeak." The click of the deadbolt was the loudest sound in the world. It echoed in the cramped office, sealing my fate within 4 mahogany walls. Seth didn't rush. He was an elder wolf, patient and cunning. He savoured the moment, his eyes shifting from a civilized brown to a predatory yellow as he stalked toward me, rounding the massive desk that was my only barrier. "Did you really think you could outsmart us, girl?" sneered Seth. His voice dropped an octave, the human cadence rough with the growl beneath. "You're nothing, a blip in our history, a mistake the king is too weak to correct." I backed away, keeping the heavy oak desk between us. My grip on the parchment was so tight my knuckles turned white. "He knows," I lied, my voice shaking but loud. "He knows everything. If you touch me, he'll tear this place apart." Seth laughed, a dry, barking sound. "He knows nothing. He's too busy wallowing in his own misery, ignoring the very thing that's killing his kingdom. You." He lunged. It wasn't a full shift, just a blur of preternatural speed. I threw myself to the side, crashing into a bookshelf as his clawed hand raked the air where my throat had just been. Books tumbled around me, dust filling the air. "You're pathetic," he spat, stalking closer, cornering me between the shelf and the wall. Vane was right. A quick arrow to the heart and Atlas breaks. We'll finally be rid of the weakling line. I scrambled backward, my hand closing around a heavy brass bookend. I hurled it with all my might. It struck Seth squarely in the chest. He didn't even flinch. He just looked down at the bruise forming beneath his silk tunic and smiled a chilling, wolfish grin. "Is that the best you have, little mouse?" He was toying with me, buying time until the council meeting adjourned and the halls filled again. I was going to die in this dusty office, holding the proof that could save Atlas, and no one would ever know. Desperation clawed at my throat. I couldn't fight him. I couldn't outrun him. But I was tethered to the most powerful creature on this continent. I closed my eyes, ignoring Seth's encroaching shadow. I reached deep inside myself, past the fear, past the adrenaline, searching for that numb, dead wire that connected me to Atlas. I found it, cold and dormant in the center of my chest. I didn't try to send a message. Words were useless now. Instead, I took every ounce of terror, every scream trapped in my throat, every visceral realization of my impending death, and I shoved it down that bond. I screamed with my soul, "Atlas!" Seth grabbed my hair, yanking my head back, exposing my neck. "Quiet now," he murmured, his breath hot and rank against my skin. "It will only hurt for a moment." The bond violently snapped open. It wasn't a gradual awakening, it was a dam breaking. A tidal wave of pure rage flooded back into me, so powerful it nearly stopped my heart. It wasn't human anger, it was ancient, primal, and utterly terrifying. The floorboards beneath our feet vibrated. A low, thrumming sound like a distant earthquake echoed through the stone corridors outside. Seth froze, his hand still tangled in my hair, his head snapping toward the door. "What in the—" The door didn't just open. It disintegrated. With a deafening boom that shook the dust from the ceiling, the heavy door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and twisted brass. Seth was thrown backward by the sheer force of the entry, releasing me as he crashed into the far wall. In the ruined doorway stood a creature from a nightmare. It was Atlas, but it wasn't the man I knew. His expensive clothes were strained at the seams, ripping across the shoulders as muscles coiled and bulged with impossible tension. His hands were no longer hands, but clawed weapons. But it was his eyes that stopped my breath. The beautiful molten gold was gone, replaced by a luminous, burning crimson that held no trace of humanity. There was no recognition in those eyes, only a bottomless pit of violence. It wasn't the king, it was the monster he kept chained in the dark. And I had just let it out. Seth scrambled to his feet, his face draining of colour. "My king," he stammered, holding his hands up in a pathetic gesture of submission. "Wait, I can explain." The monster didn't wait. It didn't speak. It moved faster than a thought. It was a blur of motion, a lethal shadow crossing the room. Atlas slammed into Seth with the force of a battering ram. There was a sickening wet crunch as Seth hit the stone wall, followed immediately by a choked gurgle. It wasn't a fight. It was an obliteration. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my hands over my ears to block out the sounds of tearing fabric and snapping bone, the wet thuds and animal snarls. It lasted seconds, but it felt like an eternity in hell. Then silence. Absolute, suffocating silence, broken only by harsh, ragged breathing that sounded like a bellows struggling for air. The metallic tang of fresh blood saturated the small room, thick enough to taste. I slowly lowered my hands and opened my eyes. Seth was gone. What remained of the traitor was a broken heap in the corner that I refused to look at directly. Atlas stood in the centre of the room, his back to me. His shoulders were heaving, his entire frame vibrating with leftover adrenaline. Blood, so much blood, dripped from his claws onto the Persian rug. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the massive figure turned. Those glowing crimson eyes locked onto me. I was frozen against the bookshelf, clutching the parchment to my chest like a shield. I had wanted him to save me. I had prayed for him to come. But as the monster took a slow, deliberate step toward me, its chest heaving, its jaw slick with blood that wasn't its own, a new kind of terror washed over me. It wasn't the fear of being hurt by an enemy. It was the primal, bone-deep terror of prey facing an apex predator that had just tasted a kill. I wasn't afraid he would strike me. I was afraid that in this state, with his humanity completely submerged beneath the tide of the wolf's rage, he would simply consume me whole. The air in the room was thick with the coppery tang of fresh blood and the lingering scent of ozone from the violent shift that had just occurred. My breath hitched in my throat as the monster took another slow, deliberate step towards me. His eyes were still that terrifying molten crimson, devoid of any recognition. His claws, slick with gore, flexed and unflexed at his sides. I pressed myself back against the bookshelf, clutching the parchment to my chest as if it could protect me from the primal force standing before me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of its own making. I had unleashed this. I had called down the monster to save myself, and now I was alone in a room with it, and the only thing that stood between me and oblivion was a bond I barely understood. Atlas, I whispered, the name feeling foreign on my tongue in the face of this creature. It was a plea, a prayer, a desperate attempt to reach the man buried beneath the beast. He stopped, his head tilting slightly, as if listening to a sound only he could hear. A low rumble vibrated deep in his chest, a sound that was more animal than human. It wasn't a threat exactly, but it was a warning, a declaration of dominance. He took another step, closing the distance between us until he was looming over me, his massive frame filling my vision. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a furnace of raw power and barely contained rage. His breath, hot and damp, washed over my face, carrying the scent of blood and something else, something wild and untamed that made my own blood sing with a strange, terrifying mixture of fear and arousal. He reached out, his hand, no, his claw, hovering inches from my face. I flinched, squeezing my eyes shut, bracing myself for pain, but it never came. Instead, I felt the rough pads of his fingers trace the line of my jaw, a touch that was surprisingly gentle, almost reverent. My eyes fluttered open to find him watching me, the crimson in his eyes swirling with something that looked almost like curiosity. He leaned closer, his nose brushing against my neck, inhaling deeply. I shivered, an involuntary reaction to his proximity, to the raw, untamed power that radiated from him. His breath hitched, and the low rumble in his chest deepened, becoming more guttural, more possessive. He pulled back slightly, his gaze locking onto mine. The crimson in his eyes had faded to a deep, smouldering gold, but the wildness was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. "Mine," he growled, the word a guttural rasp that seemed to be torn from the very depths of his soul. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a claim. He reached down and took the parchment from my trembling hands, his claws lightly grazing my skin. He didn't look at it, just crumpled it in his fist and let it drop to the floor. It was as if the evidence of treason, the very thing that had almost gotten me killed, was suddenly meaningless. He reached out again, his hand cupping my face, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone. His touch was possessive, demanding, yet there was a strange tenderness in it, a desperate need that I could feel echoing through the bond between us. "You are mine," he repeated, his voice lower now, almost a whisper, "and no one will ever touch you again." He leaned down, his lips brushing against mine, featherlight at first, then with increasing pressure. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a claiming, a branding. It was raw and hungry and desperate, a release of all the pent-up emotion, the fear, the rage, the longing that had been building between us for weeks. I melted against him, my body betraying my mind, responding to his touch with a fierce, unexpected hunger of its own. The bond between us flared to life, a blinding white heat that consumed me, blurring the lines between where I ended and he began. He pulled back, his breath ragged, his eyes burning into mine. "You were right," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I am your prison, and you are never leaving it." He swept me up into his arms, cradling me against his chest as if I weighed nothing. I clung to him, burying my face in his neck, inhaling the scent of him, wild and untamed and utterly intoxicating. He carried me out of the ruined office, stepping over the broken body of Seth without a backward glance. He strode through the palace halls, ignoring the terrified gasps and whispers of the guards and servants who scattered at his approach. He carried me straight to his chambers, kicking the door open and slamming it shut behind us with a resounding boom that echoed through the opulent room. He didn't set me down. Instead, he carried me to the massive four-poster bed, laying me down gently on the silken sheets. He loomed over me, his golden eyes burning with a hunger that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. He reached down, his hand tracing the line of my neck, his fingers lingering over the sensitive skin where my pulse hammered against my skin. "Mine," he growled again, his voice low and guttural. He leaned down, his teeth grazing the skin of my neck, just above my collarbone. I gasped, arching my back, a jolt of electricity shooting through my body. It wasn't pain, it was something else entirely, something primal and ancient and undeniably seductive. He pulled back slightly, his eyes locking onto mine, a question burning in their golden depths, a question that needed no words. Will he claim me? Will he mark me as his own, irrevocably binding me to him for all eternity? The answer hung in the air between us, unspoken, yet undeniable. The beast had been unleashed, and there was no putting it back in its cage. And as I looked into his eyes, I realized with a jolt of terrifying clarity that I didn't want to.
When your heart feels like it's fading and your faith begins to drown, when the world keeps taking and there's no strength left to be found, I know the taste of losing. I've walked that road alone, but if you reach for me tonight, I'll guide you home. Let me be the one who saves you when the dark won't let you sleep. Let me carry all your sorrows when they cut too deep. I don't need a crown or glory, I just need your heart be close. Let me be the one who saves you when you've got nowhere to go. I see the scars you try to hide, the pain behind your eyes. You say you're fine, but I can tell you're breaking inside. I trade the breath inside my chest to see you smile again. If love's a war, I'll fight the rest until the very end. Even heroes fall sometimes.